London, 1822. The candle flames flickered against the crimson damask-panelled walls, casting restless shadows that seemed to dance to the rhythm of Lady Evangeline Hartwell's racing heartbeat. The bridal chamber in the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield's residence was a masterpiece of Georgian opulence with its burgundy velvet drapes, carved mahogany furniture, and an imposing four-poster bed that dominated the center of the room like a silent throne. Evangeline stood before the Venetian mirror, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she adjusted. For the 10th time, the cashmere shawl draped over her ivory silk nightgown. Every inch of skin needed to remain hidden. Every mark needed to be shielded from the eyes that would soon examine her with the right, conferred by the gold ring now heavy on her finger. The wedding had been celebrated that morning at St. George's Chapel in Hanover Square before 300 guests of the highest rank. Lady Evangeline Hartwell, only daughter of Viscount Ashford, had been united in marriage to Lord Alexander Beaumont, Duke of Thornfield, in a ceremony that London society would comment on for weeks. Not for the visible affection between the bride and groom, for there was none, but for the magnificence of the event, the political alliances it sealed, and the combined fortune that was now intertwined under the blessing of the Church. Arranged marriage was the norm among the aristocracy, a contract as calculated as any commercial deal. And Evangeline fully understood her role in this transaction. She brought with her a generous, doughy, valuable political connections through her mother's family, and the impeccable reputation of a young woman raised under the strictest codes of conduct. The Duke in turn offered one of the oldest titles in England, estate spanning 3 counties, and a position at court that few could equal. But there was something the Duke was unaware of, something Evangeline guarded with the same zeal as a sentry, guarding the gates of a besieged fortress. Beneath the silk and velvet, beneath the layers of fine fabric that fashion demanded and that she used for added purpose, her skin told a story that should never be read. Silver marks snaked across her shoulders and down her back like cruel rivers of frozen memory. Scars that spoke of confrontations a daughter should never have with a father, of words that should never be spoken, and of consequences that should never be inflicted. This Count Ashford was known in society as a strong-willed but fair-minded man, a respected parliamentarian, and a competent administrator of his estates. What happened within the walls of Ashford Manor, away from the glare of society, was another matter entirely. Evangeline had learned early on that her father did not tolerate contradiction, especially from a daughter. When at 14 she dared to question his decisions about her education, the response came swift and painful. When at 16 she begged him to reconsider dismissing her favorite governess for a minor error, the punishment was even more severe. And when at 18 she had the audacity to suggest that perhaps he should moderate his passion for the card game that was increasingly consuming the family fortune, he had taught her a lesson that left its mark not only on her skin, but on her soul. Her mother, the gentle Lady Catherine, had watched with helpless tears in her eyes, but she had never intervened. A wife did not question her husband, a truth Lady Catherine repeated like a mantra whenever she saw Evangeline in the days following her punishments, helping her tend her wounds while whispering apologies that never quite reached her. When Lady Catherine had died 3 years earlier of a sudden fever, Evangeline had lost her only ally. Fragile though she might be, she was left alone at Ashford Manor with an increasingly irascible father and servants who knew too much but could do nothing. The marriage arrangement with the Duke of Thornfield had appeared as a salvation, albeit a cold one. At 21, Evangeline was at the age when marriage was not only expected, but necessary. Her father, eager to strengthen ties with a more powerful house, and perhaps ease his conscience by sending his daughter away from scenes they both preferred to forget, had readily accepted the proposal when the Duke's representative presented it. Lord Alexander Beaumont, at 32, had still not married despite pressure from family and society. They said he was a man devoted to the duties of his title, cold in his efficiency, fair but distant with his tenants, respected but unloved. A man sought a wife, as he would a competent steward, someone who would fulfill his duties without creating emotional complications during their brief courtship. If those formal meetings under the watchful eye of attendants could even be called courtship, Evangeline had studied her future husband with the attention of someone examining a sentence. He was tall, with broad shoulders that perfectly filled out his impeccably tailored coat, dark brown hair that he kept neatly trimmed, and deep blue eyes that seemed capable of piercing any pretense. His features were aristocratic, with a strong jaw and lips that rarely curved in any expression that could be mistaken for joy. When he spoke to her, his voice was polite but formal, his questions conventional, his answers measured. He inquired about her education, her interests in music and reading, her opinion on running a large household. He never asked about her feelings, her dreams, or her fears. And Evangeline never offered more than the appropriate answers a prospective bride should give. Now, in this room that would bear witness to the next chapter of her life, Evangeline faced the moment she had dreaded since the marriage agreement had been signed. The consummation of the marriage was a duty, an expectation, a legal necessity to validate the union. But how would she fulfill this duty without revealing what she was hiding? How would she allow the Duke to exercise his conjugal rights without exposing the scars that would transform her image as a flawless bride into something broken and damaged? She had considered keeping the room completely dark, but that would surely raise suspicions. She had considered suggesting they keep her nightgown on, but what husband would accept such a thing on their wedding night? Every scenario she imagined ended with the same devastating image, the Duke's eyes discovering her scars, his expression transforming from desire or at least determination to revulsion, into questions she could not answer without completely destroying any possibility of a functional marriage. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 10 with its melodic, relentless chimes. The wedding banquet had ended over an hour ago, the guests finally leaving after toasting the couple's health with French champagne and delivering the traditional racy remarks about the duties of the wedding night. Evangeline had been shown to the Duchess's chambers by her new lady-in-waiting, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Peyton, who had arranged her hair, helped her into the silk and lace bridal gown the Duke had sent as a gift, and then withdrawn with an encouraging smile that didn't reach her worried eyes. The woman had surely noticed the excessive care with which Evangeline insisted on keeping her shawl draped over her shoulders, the way she flinched when Mrs. Peyton tried to help her with the back of her dress. A soft sound at the adjacent door made Evangeline's heart race. Her fingers closed around the edge of her shawl, pulling it tighter. The door opened with a barely audible click, and the Duke of Thornfield entered her chambers for the first time as husband. He still wore most of his wedding attire, though his coat had been removed and his waistcoat unbuttoned, revealing the white linen shirt beneath. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, a touch of informality that contrasted strangely with his rigid posture. He held a crystal glass of amber liquid in one hand, and his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, met hers through the mirror before finally looking directly at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire in the grate and the insistent ticking of the clock. Evangeline forced herself to turn, to face him directly, as a beautiful wife would expect, but her body was rigid with apprehension. The Duke took a measured sip of his brandy, his eyes never leaving her face. Then, to her surprise, he crossed the room, not toward her, but to one of the armchairs near the fireplace, where he sat down with a barely audible sigh. "Lady Evangeline," he began, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite place. Weariness, perhaps, or resignation. "I imagine this evening is as disconcerting for your lordship as it is for me." The words were so unexpected that Evangeline blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Your Grace," she replied, her own voice trembling more than she would have liked. "I understand my duties." The Duke inclined his head, studying her with an intensity that made her wish she could disappear into the shadows. "Yes, I am sure you do. We were both raised to understand our duties above all else." He took another sip. "But before we proceed to fulfill those duties, I would like to establish certain understandings between us." Evangeline nodded, unsure of what else to do. He continued, his voice maintaining that formal tone, but not entirely devoid of something that could be called consideration. "This marriage was arranged for practical reasons, as we both know. Your family sought an advantageous alliance, and I required a wife who could fulfill the requirements of my position. There were no promises of affection, no pretense of love." She waited, her heart still racing, unsure of where he was going with this. "What I propose, Lady Evangeline, is that we build our marriage on the foundation of honesty and mutual respect, if not passion. I desire your lordship to manage my household with the competence I know you possess. I desire a companion who can appear at my side at social events without causing scandal. And I desire in due time heirs who can continue the Beaumont line. In return, I will offer protection, financial security, and the freedom to pursue your own interests within appropriate limits. He paused. And I wish you to know that I am not a cruel man. I will not raise my hand against your lordship in anger. I will not humiliate you in public or private, and I will not demand more of you than is necessary to fulfill the terms of our contract. The word struck Evangeline like an unexpected balm on old wounds. I will not raise my hand against your grace. How could he have known those specific words would mean so much? How could he have guessed that a promise of non-violence would be more valuable than any declaration of love? Your grace is very kind, she managed, her voice almost a whisper. The Duke raised an eyebrow. Gentle would be to promise you a honeymoon in Venice, or to declare feelings neither of us possess. I am simply establishing the terms under which this marriage will function most effectively. But I have noticed during our brief meetings before the wedding that your grace seems apprehensive. He leaned forward slightly. If there is something that concerns you, something you wish to communicate before we proceed, now would be the time. The offer hung between them, tempting and terrifying at the same time. Evangeline felt the words rising in her throat, the desperate need to confess, to explain, to plead for understanding for something she herself barely understood. But fear was stronger. The fear that the truth would turn the distant respect he offered into revulsion. The fear that the marks on her body would reveal not only what her father had done, but somehow the deficiency in herself that had justified such actions. There is nothing, your grace, she lied, pulling her shawl tighter around her. I am simply inexperienced in these matters, which is perfectly natural and expected, he replied, finishing his brandy and placing the glass on the side table. He stood, and Evangeline felt her entire body tense like a bowring. The Duke crossed the room toward her with measured steps, stopping a respectable distance away. "May I?" he asked, indicating the shawl she clutched like armor. Evangeline felt panic rising. She desperately searched for an excuse, any reason to maintain the protection of the fabric. "I feel a slight chill, your grace, the night air during the carriage ride." He frowned slightly. "Are you indisposed? We can postpone this duty if your health requires it." "No," she answered too quickly, realizing that delay would only prolong the inevitable. "I am fine, your grace, just a little chilly." "Then allow me to feed the fire," he said, turning to add more wood to the hearth. The flames leaped higher, casting more light into the room, and Evangeline almost groaned in despair. More light meant fewer places to hide. When the Duke turned to her again, there was something different in his expression, a softness that had not been there before. "Lady Evangeline," he said, his voice lower, "now I understand that your grace may be nervous. It is natural. But I wish you to know that I am not a brute. I will be as gentle as circumstances allow." The words, spoken with genuine sincerity, nearly shattered Evangeline's carefully constructed defenses. Tears stung the backs of her eyes, but she forced them back. Crying now would only raise more questions. "I am grateful, your grace," she whispered. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation she placed hers in it. His fingers were warm, his grip firm but not oppressive. He led her gently toward the bed, and with each step, Evangeline felt the weight of the inevitable approaching. When they reached the bedside, the Duke paused again. His hands moved to the knots of the shawl around her shoulders, and Evangeline couldn't contain the slight shiver that ran through her. He noticed immediately, his hands pausing mid-movement. "Your grace is trembling," he observed. "Are you that afraid?" The question carried not accusation, but something close to concern. Evangeline closed her eyes, summoning every shred of courage she possessed. "Not afraid of your grace," she said. And it was true. She wasn't afraid that he would intentionally hurt her. She was only afraid of his reaction to what he would discover. So afraid of what? He pressed gently. She opened her eyes, finding his fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel completely exposed, even though she was still fully clothed. Of disappointing him, she finally said, choosing a half-truth. The Duke studied her for another long moment. Then his hands resumed their movement, undoing the shawls, not with deliberate care. The fabric began to slip, and Evangeline felt as if every inch of cashmere that fell took with it a layer of protection that could never be recovered. The shawl fell completely, pooling around her feet, and the ivory silk nightgown was exposed to the candlelight. The fabric was beautiful, embroidered with delicate floral motifs in silver thread, but it was also semi-transparent at certain angles, especially in the direct firelight. Evangeline remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the Duke's shoulder, not daring to look at his face and see the exact moment when he would notice. But that moment didn't come immediately. Instead, the Duke moved behind her, and she felt his fingers on the sash that held her nightgown together. He untied it with efficient movements, and then his hands rested lightly on her shoulders, preparing to slide the straps down. And it was then, under the direct touch of his hands on the thin fabric, that he felt it. The irregularities in the skin that should have been smooth, the grooves were scar tissue-formed raised lines. He stopped completely, his fingers exploring with growing disbelief what they found. Evangeline felt the exact moment when understanding replaced confusion. His fingers traced a more pronounced scar, following it from her shoulder toward her back. "What?" he began, his voice suddenly rough. "What is this?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand. Evangeline squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could simply disappear. "Nothing. Your Grace, it doesn't matter." "This matters," he countered, his voice growing more intense. "Turn around." It wasn't a request. Slowly, feeling as if she were walking to her own execution, Evangeline turned to face him. Her eyes still avoided his, fixed instead on the mother-of-pearl button on his shirt. "Look at me," he commanded, and reluctantly she obeyed. What she saw on his face wasn't what she expected. There was no revulsion there, no contempt. Instead, there was a rage so intense it almost made her recoil, but she could tell it wasn't directed at her. "Who?" he asked with dangerous calm. "Did this to you?" Evangeline felt her throat close. "I said, it doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he cut her off. "Turn around," he repeated. But this time his voice held something different. It wasn't a command, but a tense request with restrained emotion. When she didn't move, he gently placed his hands on her shoulders and turned her so that her back was to him. She felt him locate the ties of her nightgown at the nape of her neck, felt him untie them with fingers that trembled slightly. The fabric loosened, slid, and then she was there, exposed from the waist up, every scar revealed in the merciless candlelight. The silence that followed was absolute. Evangeline waited for the recoil, the gasp of shock, the questions she couldn't answer without completely destroying any hope of dignity. But what came was different. She felt the Duke's fingers, incredibly gentle, tracing a long scar that ran diagonally from her left shoulder to the middle of her back. Then another and another, as if he were memorizing a map of suffering written on her flesh. "This was a whip," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, but charged with a fury so deep it seemed to vibrate in the air. Not just once, multiple times, for years. Evangeline didn't trust her voice to answer. "Turn to me," he demanded again. And this time she obeyed, clutching her loose nightgown to her chest, but allowing him to see her face. "Who did this?" he repeated. And this time there was something in her eyes, an intensity that demanded truth. "My father," she whispered, the words coming out like a forced confession. "The Viscount Ashford," he said, and it wasn't a question. His jaw clenched until a muscle pulsed visibly beneath the skin. For what offense had he deemed fit to brand his daughter like a disobedient horse? Evangeline swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze steady. For having a mind of her own, for questioning his decisions, for begging her to stop throwing away the family fortune, for being everything a daughter shouldn't be in his eyes. "And your mother?" he asked. "Where was she while this was happening?" "My mother," Evangeline said softly, "did what every proper wife does. She looked away and prayed for her to pass quickly. She died 3 years ago. and perhaps it was a mercy. The Duke turned abruptly, walking to the window with stiff steps. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and she could see the tension in every line of his back. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled with visible effort. "Why didn't you reveal this before the wedding?" Evangeline almost laughed, a humorless sound. "And say what? Your Grace, that I am damaged, that I bear marks of shame beneath the silks and velvets, that any man who marries me will discover he has purchased effective merchandise." He whirled so quickly she nearly jumped. "No," he said fiercely, "do not you dare place this shame upon yourself. The shame belongs to the man who wielded the whip, not to the one who bore it." Evangeline blinked, disarmed by the vehemence in his voice. "Your Grace is kind to say so, but it is not kindness. It is true." He interrupted her. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping before her. Without warning, he knelt, his hands finding hers where she still clutched her nightgown to her chest. "Lady Evangeline," he said, and there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before, something raw and unguarded. "I've been called many things in my life, cold, calculating, devoid of deeper feelings, and perhaps there's truth to those accusations. But one thing I'll never be is a man who sees another's suffering and turns away." He squeezed her hands gently. "Your father will be held accountable for his actions. I swear this." Evangeline felt tears finally escape, tracing hot trails down her cheeks. "Your Grace doesn't understand. He is my father, despite everything he is, and to reveal this publicly only." "I will not speak publicly," he promised, "but Viscount Ashford will learn that his daughter is now under my protection, and that anyone who tries to harm her again, be he Viscount or King, will answer to me." There was an absolute certainty in his words that made something inside Evangeline's chest loosen, something that had been tight for so long she'd forgotten what it was like to breathe freely. The Duke stood and gently, with infinite care, helped her up as well. "Your lordship is exhausted," he said, his voice regaining a touch of formality, but without losing its gentleness. "And I was a callous fool to pressure you when you're clearly not in a condition to do so." He took the velvet robe that was draped over the chair and draped it over her shoulders, tying it carefully so she was completely covered. "But your Grace," she began, confused. "Our duties can wait," he said firmly. "I will not take advantage of you when you are still shaken by memories you should not carry." He gently guided her to the bed, pulling the covers back. "Rest tonight, Lady Evangeline. Tomorrow, we will begin building this marriage on proper foundations." "But the marriage will not be valid without," she insisted, a last shred of practical concern asserting itself, even through emotional exhaustion. "It will be valid when I say it is," he replied, with an aristocratic arrogance that in any other circumstance might have offended her, but in that moment sounded like protection. He waited while she slid under the covers, then pulled them up to her chin with almost paternal care. "Sleep," he ordered gently. "I will be in the adjoining room if you need anything." "And Lady Evangeline," he added, pausing at the door connecting his chambers to hers, "understand this. These marks do not make you less of a person in my eyes. They make you more. They prove a strength few possess." With that he walked through the door, closing it softly behind him. Evangeline stood still for a long moment, processing everything that had happened. She had come to this evening expecting at best clinical indifference and at worst outright revulsion. Instead, she had found understanding, justified anger on her behalf, and a promise of protection that sounded as absolute as any sacred vow. Tears came then earnestly, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of cautious hope, of a possibility she had never dared imagine. Maybe, just maybe, this arranged marriage could become something more. Maybe she had found not just a husband, but an ally. Maybe for the first time since her mother died, she was not completely alone. In the adjoining room, Alexander Beaumont, Duke of Thornfield, stood before his own window, staring out at sleeping London without really seeing her. His hands still trembled slightly with suppressed rage, his jaw ached from clenching. He had thought he understood the complexities of the aristocratic world, had thought nothing could shock him. But the marks he had seen on his wife's back, the story of systematic abuse they told, had awakened something in him he hadn't known he possessed. a protective rage so intense it threatened his famous control. He had considered this marriage a practical transaction. He needed a wife, an eweis, someone to manage his household and appear at his side at social events. Lady Evangeline Hartwell met all the requirements on paper. But the woman he had met tonight, the woman who had deep pain beneath a facade of perfect composure, was so much more than any list of qualifications could capture. He had returned to society after years of service on the Iberian Peninsula during the Napoleonic Wars. He had seen men die in horrific ways, witnessed the cruelty humans could inflict on each other on the battlefield. But somehow the systematic cruelty Evangeline had suffered in her own home at the hands of those who were supposed to protect her seemed even more horrific. Perhaps because there was no war to justify it, no foreign enemy to fight, only a father wielding absolute power over a daughter who had dared to speak out. Alexander made a decision. Then he had guaranteed an obedient wife in his marriage. But now he understood that he did not desire obedience born of fear. He wanted to build something different, though he still didn't know exactly what. He only knew that the woman sleeping in the next room deserved more than he had originally planned to offer. And Alexander Beaumont, when he made a decision, always saw it through to the end. Morning light filtered through the heavy curtains when Evangeline awoke, momentarily disoriented. The memory of the previous night gradually returned, and with it a complex mix of emotions. Relief certainly, but also apprehension. What would happen now? How would they move forward? She sat up in bed, noticing that someone had entered while she slept and lit the fire, brought fresh water for the wash basin, and left a tray with tea and toast. Her new lady in waiting, probably carrying out her duties discreetly. Evangeline was finishing dressing when a knock sounded on the door connecting her chambers to the Duke's. "Come in," she called, her voice hesitant. Alexander entered, already fully dressed in riding clothes, his hair still damp from a recent bath. "Good morning, Lady Evangeline," he greeted formally. But there was something different in his eyes, a softness that had not been present before the previous night. "I hope you have rested adequately." "Yes, thank you." "Your Grace," she replied, uncertain of the protocol for this unprecedented situation. "Excellent." He remained near the door, maintaining a respectful distance. "I have taken the liberty of making some arrangements. In an hour we will depart for Thornfield Hall, the country estate my primary residence in Yorkshire." Evangeline blinked in surprise. So soon? But the London season has only just begun, and there are certainly social expectations. "Expectations that can wait," he said with finality. "I have considered the matter carefully throughout the evening. London is full of prying eyes and indiscreet tongues. I wish we had time to establish our marriage away from such scrutiny. Besides," he added, his tone getting slightly harder, "I prefer to put some distance between you and your father before our next conversation takes place." Evangeline's stomach tightened. "Does your Grace intend to confront him?" "I intend to clarify certain points," he said evasively. "But this is not your lordship's concern. Your only duty is to prepare for the journey. Mrs. Patton is already supervising the packing of your belongings. And if I prefer to remain in London," she tested, curious to see how he would react to the opposition. Alexander inclined his head, considering, "Then we will remain, though I confess I would be disappointed. I believe Thornfield Hall would please you. The gardens are particularly beautiful at this time of year, and the library contains one of the most extensive collections of literature in the north of England." He paused. "But the choice is your lordship's. I will not make you a prisoner." The offer of choice, so unlike anything she had known, touched something deep within her. "Yorkshire sounds enchanting. Your Grace, I will be ready within the hour." The journey north took 3 days, stopping at carefully selected inns along the way. Alexander maintained a respectful distance throughout the journey, chatting with her about neutral topics during meals, but ensuring they had separate rooms each night. Evangeline appreciated his consideration, even as a small part of her began to wonder if perhaps he simply didn't desire her now that he knew about her scars. But then she would catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher, an intensity that made her pulse race, and that worry would dissipate. Thornfield Hall emerged from the rolling Yorkshire hills like something from a fairy tale, an imposing grey-stone mansion with turrets at every corner and hundreds of windows that glowed in the afternoon sun. The estate stretched for miles in every direction, with well-tended fields dotted with sheep, ancient woodlands, and in the distance the wild moors that characterized this part of England. "It is magnificent," Evangeline whispered, as the carriage rolled down the long driveway lined with ancient oak trees. "It is your home now," Alexander replied, a touch of pride in his voice. "I hope your lordship finds you comfortable. The staff are looking forward to meeting your new duchess." The staff indeed lined the steps of the main entrance from butler to junior kitchen maid, all in their finest uniforms. Alexander helped her from the carriage and guided her through the introductions. Each servant bowed or bowed respectfully, and Evangeline responded with the grace years of social training had instilled, but inside she felt like an imposter. How could she be duchess of all this when she carried shame beneath her silks? The butler, a dignified silver-haired man named Hartwell, led them inside. "The Duchess's house has been prepared according to your instructions, Your Grace," he told Alexander, "and dinner will be served at 7 if that is suitable." "Perfectly suitable," Alexander confirmed. "Please show the Duchess to her rooms. I will be in my study attending to correspondence that has accumulated during my absence." The Duchess's apartments occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of sage green and golden cream. There was a sitting room overlooking the formal gardens, a walk-in closet larger than her entire bedroom at Ashford Manor, a private boudoir, and finally the bedroom itself, dominated by a 4-poster bed with embroidered silk curtains. Everything was luxurious yet elegant, clearly arranged by someone with refined taste. "This was your work, Your Grace?" Evangeline asked, turning to Alexander, who had followed despite his stated duties. "I confess I had assistance from my aunt, Lady Margaret." He admitted she has served as hostess at Thornfield since my mother's death 8 years ago. He left for his own estate as soon as our engagement was announced, feeling it appropriate for the new Duchess to establish her own household. But she left detailed instructions on what she considered necessary. Evangeline moved around the room, her fingers lightly touching the fine furniture, the silk curtains, the carefully selected books on the shelves. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "Please convey my gratitude to Lady Margaret. You can do so yourself. She will return for dinner tomorrow night, eager to meet you." Alexander hesitated, then added, "I must warn you that my aunt is quite direct in her opinions. Don't let her intimidate you." Evangeline almost smiled at the idea that anything could intimidate her after what she had already endured. "I am certain we will get along well, Your Grace." Alexander nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, he crossed the room to her, stopping at an appropriate distance. "Lady Evangeline," he began, then paused as if struggling with the words. "Yes, Your Grace. I wish your lordship to understand," he continued carefully, "that while I have postponed certain aspects of our marriage contract, this should not be construed as a lack of interest." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I simply wish to proceed in a manner that is comfortable for both of us. And when your lordship is ready, when you trust me not to hurt or judge you, then we will fulfill all aspects of our marriage vows." Evangeline felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I understand, Your Grace, and I thank you for your patience." "It is not patience. It is respect," he corrected. With that, he bowed formally and departed, leaving her alone in her new quarters. The following days established a pattern. Mornings were spent with Mrs. Peaton reviewing household responsibilities, meeting the staff, and learning the routines of Thornfield Hall. Alexander proved correct in his assessment. She had a natural talent for household management, and the staff responded well to her gentle but firm leadership. Afternoons were often spent in the magnificent library, where she discovered her passion for literature. Being nourished by volumes she had never before accessed, and evenings were spent at dinners with Alexander, where they discussed books, politics, and philosophy, gradually getting to know each other as people rather than simply husband and wife by contract. Alexander revealed himself to be deeper than his cold manner suggested. He spoke eloquently of his wartime experiences, of the men he had served alongside, of the futility and horror of conflict. He spoke of his responsibilities as a landowner, his desire to implement more modern farming methods that would benefit both the land and his tenants. He spoke rarely but with genuine affection of his mother and how her untimely death had left a void at Thornfield that no other person had been able to fill. Evangeline, for her part, found herself sharing more than she had ever expected. She spoke of her lonely upbringing, of the books that had sustained her through difficult times, of her dreams of perhaps one day writing something of her own, though she knew such ambition was unbecoming of a woman of her position. And gradually, cautiously, she began to speak of her mother, of the gentle but weak woman she had loved but had failed to protect. It was during one of these late-night conversations, a week after their arrival at Thornfield, that the topic of her father finally resurfaced. They were in the library after dinner, Alexander with a glass of port, Evangeline with tea, when he casually mentioned, "I received correspondence from Viscount Ashford today." Evangeline's entire body stiffened. "Did he write to your Grace? What did he say?" Alexander took a measured sip before replying. "He expressed paternal concern for your well-being and requested permission to visit Thornfield to personally ascertain that you were being properly cared for." Evangeline felt bile rise in her throat. "And did your Grace respond?" "I did," Alexander confirmed. "I informed him that you are perfectly well and that visits from Ashford Manor are not desired at this time. I made it clear, so as not to be misinterpreted, that any concerns he might have about your treatment are unnecessary, and given certain evidence that has come to my attention, quite hypocritical." "Your Grace mentioned," Evangeline began, her heart pounding about the marks. "Not directly," he assured her, "but I have given you to understand that I am aware of certain events in your childhood and that I do not approve." His reaction was instructive. There was a long pause before he elaborated, followed by a rather emphatic letter, insisting that matters of family discipline are none of the business of strangers, even if those strangers are now family by marriage. "He is my father," Evangeline said weakly, unsure why she still felt the need to defend the man who had marked her. "He is your torment," Alexander corrected gently but firmly. "And while I cannot undo the past, I can ensure that he has no opportunity to repeat such acts. Your lordship is now under my protection, and that protection is not merely nominal." Evangeline felt conflicting emotions war within her, relief that Alexander truly intended to keep her safe, guilt for causing strife between families, and something else, something warm and dangerously close to affection for this man who, though cold in his manner, was warm in his actions. "You are very good to me, your Grace," she said softly. "I am your husband," he replied, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. He stood, crossing to where she sat and extending his hand. "Come, there is something I wish to show you." Intrigued, she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her out of the library, through candle-lit corridors, to a wing of the house she had not yet explored. He stopped before a heavy oak door and opened it, revealing a studio bathed in soft moonlight through large windows. An easel was positioned near the window. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against the walls, and the scent of oil paint permeated the air. "This was my mother's studio," Alexander explained. "She was a talented artist, though she painted only for her own pleasure. After her death, I closed this room, unable to bear to enter it, but recently I have begun to think that perhaps it is time to allow it to live again." Evangeline moved slowly around the room, examining the paintings. They were mostly landscapes of Thornfield and the surrounding region, executed with considerable skill and a sensitive eye for light and colour. "They are beautiful," she sighed. "Your mother had great talent." "She did," he agreed. "And I mentioned this because your Grace spoke of your desire to perhaps write. I wondered if this space could be transformed for your use. A desk instead of an easel, paper and ink instead of canvas and paints. A place where your Grace could pursue your own creative ambitions, away from eyes that might deem such pursuits unfit for a duchess." The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly suited to the secret desires she had barely admitted to herself, that Evangeline felt tears sting her eyes. "Would your Grace do this for me?" "Why not?" Alexander asked, genuinely confused. "You are my wife. Your happiness is not only desirable, but necessary for the proper functioning of our household. If writing brings you joy, then you should write." Evangeline turned to face him. This man who continued to amaze her every day. I don't know how to adequately thank you for such kindness." "No thanks required," he said, but there was a hint of color in his cheeks that suggested he was more affected by her gratitude than his casual tone indicated. "Simply make use of the space as you wish. I will have it rearranged to your specifications." They stood there for a long moment, the moonlight spilling through the windows and enveloping them in silver. Evangeline was intensely aware of his nearness, of the heat emanating from his body, of the way his eyes, always so controlled, seemed to darken slightly when they rested on her. "Your Grace?" she began, then hesitated, unsure how to articulate what she felt. "Yes, Alexander," she said softly, using his name for the first time without the formal title. "Could you?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Ask you to call me by my name as well." Without the lady, without the formal distance, he studied her for a long moment, something changing in her expression. "Evangeline," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like something precious. She took a half-step closer, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "And could she," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "ask one more favor?" "Anything," he answered, and it sounded as if he truly meant it. She lifted her hand, letting it hover in the air between them, a silent question. Alexander understood immediately. Slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wished, he covered her hand with his. Their fingers intertwined, and Evangeline felt the warmth of his touch run down her arm. "I am not afraid of your touch," she said softly. "I have realized this in these past weeks. Your kindness, your patience have taught me that not every touch need be followed by pain." Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "I will never raise my hand against you in anger. This I have sworn, and it is an oath I will keep until my dying breath." "I know," she said, and realized it was true. She trusted this man in ways she had never expected to trust anyone again. "And I wish," she continued, forcing herself to complete the thought, even as her face burned with embarrassment for our marriage to be complete. "In every way." Alexander's eyes widened slightly. "Are you sure? I don't wish to rush you into something before you're ready." "I am ready," she insisted. "Or at least I wish to be ready. I wish to stop letting the past dictate the future." He lifted her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that made her shiver. "Then let us return to your chambers," he said softly, "and let me show you what touch should be like. Let me replace bad memories with good ones. If at any time you wish to stop, just say so, and I will stop immediately. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. The walk back to her quarters passed in a blur. Evangeline was intensely aware of his hand holding hers, the heat of his body next to hers, the anticipatory tremor coursing through her veins. When they reached her door, Alexander paused. "One last time," he said, his eyes searching hers in the dim candlelight of the hallway. "Are you absolutely sure?" In answer, she opened the door and pulled him inside. The room was warmed by the fire in the great candles already lit by her maid before retiring for the night. Alexander closed the door behind them, then simply stood there, allowing her to set the pace. Evangeline walked to him with shaky but determined steps. Her hands moved to the cravat around his neck, and he remained perfectly still as she untied it with fingers that trembled only slightly. The fabric fell away, and she moved to the buttons of his waistcoat. He captured her hands gently. "Allow me," he said softly. With efficient movements, he removed his vest and shirt, revealing the muscular chest sculpted by years of military training. Evangeline allowed her eyes to trace over him, noting the scar that ran along his ribs, another that cut across his shoulder. "You were marked too," she whispered. "War," he explained simply. "Nothing compared to what you endured. But yes, we all carry our marks." She reached out, her fingers tracing the scar on his ribs. He shivered beneath her touch, but not from pain, from suppressed desire. "Your turn," he said huskily. She nodded, turning so he could access the clasps of her dress. His fingers worked the buttons with infinite patience, and gradually the dress loosened. He pushed it off her shoulders, allowing it to fall in a pool of silk at her feet. The shift underneath was thin, but still covered her scars. For a moment, the old fear resurfaced. What if even now, even after everything, he recoiled when he saw it? But then she remembered his words that first night. "These marks don't make you any less of a person in my eyes. They make you more." With trembling but determined hands, she pulled the slip over her head. Standing before him in nothing but her silk stockings, the firelight danced across her skin, highlighting every silvery scar that marred her shoulders and back. She forced herself not to cover herself to allow him to see everything. Alexander circled slowly, his eyes tracing each mark. When he completed the circle and stood before her again, there was reverence in his face. "Beautiful," he said simply. "Every scar is a testament to your strength. Every mark proves that you survived what should have broken you." He reached out, his fingers tracing the longest scar with a delicacy that made her breath catch. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known." Then he leaned in, pressing a soft kiss against the scar on her shoulder, then another against the mark on her collarbone, a third against the line that cut across her left shoulder. With each kiss, Evangeline felt something inside her begin to heal. Old wounds beginning to close, not because the scars disappeared, but because they were finally honored instead of hidden. Alexander lifted her into his arms, carrying her to the bed. He laid her down on the silk covers, then joined her, his large body hovering over hers, but braced against her arms so as not to crush her with his weight. "Remember," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Say stop, and I will." She nodded but knew she wouldn't need to, because when he finally touched her, when his hands explored her body with infinite reverence, when his lips followed the path of her fingers, there was no pain. There was only pleasure, gentle and building, a tide of sensation that swept her away. He was patient, infinitely patient, learning what made her sigh, what made her arch against him. And when they finally joined, when they became husband and wife in every sense, there was nothing cold or transactional about it. There was warmth, there was connection, and for the first time in her life, Evangeline understood what people meant when they talked about the beauty of physical union. Later, as they lay tangled together under the covers, her head resting on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart, Alexander pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you," he murmured. "Why?" she asked sleepily. "For trusting me," he said simply, "for allowing me to show you that not every touch is followed by pain." The following months brought a transformation Evangeline never would have imagined possible. Her marriage, which began as a cold, practical arrangement, blossomed into something rich and profound. Alexander proved to be a caring husband, interested not only in her duties but in her thoughts, her dreams, her opinions on everything from politics to literature. He fulfilled his promise about the studio, transforming it into a perfect haven where she spent her mornings writing, developing stories that emerged from her imagination with an ease that surprised her. He even encouraged her, reading her early efforts and offering constructive criticism that helped her improve. And their nights were spent exploring the passion they had discovered, learning each other's bodies with a dedication that transformed duty into joy. Evangeline learned that her body, scarred as it was still capable of pleasure. She learned that Alexander's hands on her skin brought not pain but delight, and slowly, scar by scar, he helped her reclaim what her father had tried to steal, her autonomy over her own body. Spring turned to summer, and Thornfield Hall blossomed around her. The gardens burst with color, the fields ripened with bountiful harvests, and the house itself seemed to breathe with new life. The staff noticed the change in their lord, how he smiled more easily, how his characteristic stiffness softened when the Duchess entered the room. And they also noticed how the Duchess, initially so reserved and careful, gradually relaxed, her smile becoming more genuine, her laughter echoing through the halls. It was during a horseback ride through the fields in early summer that Evangeline decided to broach the topic she had been avoiding. They had dismounted near a stream to let the horses drink, and were sitting beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree. "Alexander," she began, using the name that now came naturally, "there is something I must tell you." He turned to her, concern immediately flashing in his eyes. "Are you well? Are you ill?" No, she assured him quickly, touching his hand. "It is nothing like that." It's just, she took a deep breath. There's something I should know about myself, about my family that might affect our future prospects. Alexander waited patiently for her to continue. My mother, Evangeline said slowly, lost 3 babies before finally carrying me to term. And after my birth, the doctors told her she shouldn't try again, that another pregnancy would likely kill her. It's possible I inherited her difficulties. It's possible I won't be able to give you the heirs you need. Alexander was silent for a long moment, processing this information. Then he asked, "Is that why your father?" He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. That he blamed me, that he punished me. She shrugged partly. Perhaps an only child means the title will pass to a distant cousin when he dies. He always saw it as my failing, as if I could control such things. And you're afraid, Alexander said slowly, that I'll react the same way if you can't conceive. Evangeline couldn't meet his gaze. The pressure on a wife to produce heirs is immense. Your Grace, I don't. She wouldn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what she meant. Alexander moved to kneel before her, capturing her face between his palms. Evangeline, look at me. She obeyed reluctantly. I heard me well, he said intensely. Yes, heirs are desirable. Yes, there are expectations. But do you know what is more important to me than any heir? She shook her head mutely. Your health, your happiness, your life. If we are blessed with children, I will be grateful. If not, then my cousin will inherit and life will go on, but I will not sacrifice you on the altar of succession. We will not repeat the mistakes of your parents. But what if society? Evangeline began to hell with society, Alexander said with unusual vehemence. They can say whatever they want. They will not dictate the terms of our marriage. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. Now enough of this somber talk. The day is too beautiful to waste it worrying about futures that may never materialize. But the future, as it happens, had other plans. In late summer, Evangeline began experiencing a peculiar morning sickness. At first, she dismissed it as something she had eaten, but when it persisted for a week, then 2, Mrs. Peaton discreetly suggested that perhaps the Duchess should see a doctor. Dr. Morrison, the family physician who had served the Bowmans for decades, examined her thoroughly and then smiled. Congratulations, Your Grace, you are expecting a child. Evangeline felt fear and joy war within her in equal parts. A child. She carried a life within her, something precious and terrifying at the same time. Are you certain? She whispered. Absolutely certain, Your Grace, the doctor confirmed. I would estimate you are approximately 2 months along. If everything continues as it is, we can expect a birth in early spring. And as for Evangeline hesitated, searching for the right words. My mother struggled. Is there reason to worry? Dr. Morrison frowned thoughtfully. I know your mother's medical history, Lady Catherine. Indeed, she had challenges, but every woman is different, every pregnancy unique. For now, you appear healthy and strong. We will monitor your condition carefully and take all necessary precautions. But I see no reason to anticipate difficulties at this time. He paused. You must inform His Grace immediately. He will, I am sure, be immensely pleased. After the doctor departed, Evangeline sat in her chambers, one hand unconsciously moving to her still flat belly. A life was growing there, half hers, half Alexander's. A child who would be loved, protected, never to know the fear that had defined her own childhood. The responsibility of this made her dizzy, but also brought a fierce determination. She would break the cycle. This child would grow up knowing only kindness and encouragement. Alexander was in his office when she finally came to find him, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence. He looked up when she entered and immediately noticed something in her expression. What happened? He asked, standing quickly. Is this your father? Did he try to contact you again? No, she said quickly, closing the door behind her. It's nothing bad. At least I hope you don't consider it that. She took a deep breath. Alexander, I'm expecting a child. He stood completely still for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he crossed the office in 3 long strides, scooped her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing in a way she'd never heard before. Young and free and completely untethered. A child, he repeated, gently lowering her but keeping her close. Evangeline, This is wonderful. So, you're not disappointed? She asked, confused by his reaction. Disappointed? He stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. Why in the world would I be disappointed? Why did it happen so quickly? She said. We've barely been married 6 months. I thought you might have preferred more time first. Evangeline, he interrupted gently, this is the best news I could have received. He pressed a hand to her stomach reverently. A child. Our child. Then his eyes narrowed slightly with concern. But what about your health? Do you remember your mother's struggles? Dr. Morrison says I'm healthy, she assured him. He will monitor my condition carefully, and I promise I'll take every necessary precaution. Alexander pulled her into a hug, his chin resting on the top of her head. I won't let anything happen to you, he said fiercely. I'll hire the best doctors in London if necessary. You and our child will receive every possible care. She sank into his embrace, allowing his strength to sustain her. We have each other, she whispered. That's more than enough. The following months brought changes both physically and emotionally. Evangeline's body gradually transformed, her womb expanding with the life growing within. Alexander became almost comically protective, insisting that she rest frequently, avoid strenuous activity, and eat properly. She found his concern both exasperating and touching, but she allowed his fussing because she understood they came from a place of genuine love. News of her pregnancy spread quickly through society. Congratulatory letters arrived from all over England, including, to her surprise, a formal note from her father expressing satisfaction that she had fulfilled her duty to secure the succession. Evangeline tore up the letter without reading beyond the first few lines. She no longer needed the Viscount's approval. She had everything she needed here at Thornfield with Alexander. It was during her 7th month of pregnancy that the complication she had feared finally manifested. She was in her study, working on a manuscript she hoped to one day publish under a pseudonym, when a sharp pain shot through her belly. She gasped, her pen falling and staining the paper with ink. Mrs. Peaton, who was organizing books nearby, immediately noticed. Your Grace, what's wrong? Pain, Evangeline managed through gritted teeth. Mrs. Peaton, send for Dr. Morrison immediately. And for his Grace. The lady-in-waiting needed no further instructions. She ran out shouting for servants, and within minutes the entire house was in turmoil. Alexander burst into the study, his face pale. Evangeline, he said, kneeling beside her, where she now slumped in her chair. What can I do? How can I help? Just stay with me, she whispered, grabbing his hand. Please don't leave me alone, never, he promised fiercely. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, his calm presence bringing some order to the chaos. He examined Evangeline thoroughly, while Alexander paced outside the room, refusing to go any further. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was serious. Your Grace, he told Alexander, the Duchess is in premature labor. It's too soon, Alexander said, his face growing even paler. She's only 7 months along. The child both are at risk, Dr. Morrison said frankly. I will not serve you by lying. The next few hours will be critical, but the Duchess is strong and I will do everything in my power. Alexander nodded stiffly. May I see her soon? She's asking for you. Evangeline lay on the bed, her face glistening with sweat, but she smiled faintly when he entered. Here you are, she whispered. I thought you might have escaped. Run away, he said, sitting down beside the bed and taking her hand. From you? Impossible. Alexander, she said, her grip tightening as another contraction ripped through her. If something happens, if I have to choose. No, he cut her off fiercely. Don't make me make that choice. We won't talk about such things. You will both survive. You have to. I can't. He paused, his voice breaking. I can't lose you. Not now. Not when I finally found you. He hadn't finished. But she understood. Love, she whispered. You say you love me. I love, he confessed. The words finally released after months of being felt but unsaid. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And when this is over, when you're both safe, I will say it every day for the rest of our lives. She smiled through the pain. Then I will have to survive, won't I? I can't miss the chance to hear those words repeated. You have to survive, he corrected, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Because I don't know how to go on living without you. The next few hours were the longest of Alexander's life. He was relegated to waiting in the hallway, while Dr. Morrison and the midwife worked. He could hear Evangeline's muffled sounds of pain through the heavy door, and each moan was like a knife to his heart. He paced, prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, and mentally promised that if she survived, he would dedicate the rest of his life to ensuring her happiness. Finally, as the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the sound he'd been waiting for came. A baby's cry, faint but distinct. He was at the door in an instant, but the midwife emerged before he could enter, carrying a small bundle. Your Grace, she said, smiling, you have a son, small but with strong lungs. And Evangeline, he demanded. The Duchess. She's tired, but well, Dr. Morrison said, appearing behind the midwife. It was hard, but she's stronger than she looks. You can see it now. Alexander barely glanced at the son the midwife was trying to show him. So focused was he on reaching Evangeline. She was pale, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but her eyes were open and clear when he entered. Alexander, she whispered. Our son healthy, he assured her, sitting beside the bed and taking her hand. And most importantly, how are you? Exhausted, she admitted, but alive and ready to meet our son properly. Alexander motioned to the midwife who brought the bundle and carefully placed it in Evangeline's arms. She pulled back the blanket, revealing a tiny, perfectly formed face. The baby had a dusting of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes briefly, they were a deep blue like Alexander's. He is perfect, Evangeline sighed. So small, yet perfect. What shall we name him? Alexander, she said without hesitation. Alexander James Beaumont, after his father. He felt his throat tighten with emotion. Are you serious? Completely, she said, looking at him with clear love in her exhausted eyes. He will be named after the man who taught me that strength and kindness are not opposites, the man who showed me that brands don't define worth, the man I love more than I thought it possible to love. Alexander leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. You are extraordinary, he murmured, and I am the luckiest man in England. The child between them chose that moment to make a small sound, and they both laughed, the sound mingling with tears of relief and joy. They stayed like that for a long time, a new family, preciously united, as the morning light filled the room and Thornfield Hall awoke to a new day. Dr. Morrison insisted that Evangeline rest completely for several weeks after her birth. Alexander carried out these orders with almost tyrannical zeal, ensuring she didn't lift a finger unnecessarily. He even brought the baby to her when he needed feeding, sat with her during the long nights when young Alexander decided that sleep was optional, and generally behaved like a completely devoted husband and father. As Evangeline regained her strength and the baby thrived, a new routine established itself. Mornings were for the family, the three of them together in the hastily prepared nursery. Alexander proved surprisingly adept at handling the baby, his large, strong hands holding the tiny body with infinite care. In the afternoons, Evangeline gradually resumed her writing, now with a new perspective to inform her stories. And the evenings were theirs, moments stolen between parental responsibilities, where they reminded each other that they were not only parents but also husband and wife. It was during one such evening, when young Alexander was finally sleeping peacefully in the crib beside their bed, that the conversation turned to topics they had avoided. Evangeline, Alexander said, tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder, there is something I must ask you. Have you thought about your father? She stiffened slightly, then forced herself to relax. Sometimes, she admitted, especially now that we have our own son. I wonder how a father can look at a child and feel anything other than protective love. How could he, she paused, then continued. How could he raise his hand against me repeatedly? Alexander tightened his hold. I can't answer that. Some men are broken in ways that make it impossible to love properly, but I know this, our son will never know such cruelty. He will grow up knowing he is loved unconditionally, that his opinions are valued, that mistakes are learning opportunities, not grounds for punishment. "I know," she said softly, "and I am grateful for that more than I can express." She paused. "Have you received any more correspondence from him?" Alexander hesitated, then decided on honesty. "A letter arrived yesterday. He requests permission to visit to meet his grandson." "Of course," I declined. But Evangeline turned in his arms to face him. "Perhaps we should reconsider." "You can't be serious," Alexander said, clearly shocked. "After everything he's done." "Precisely because of everything he's done," she said thoughtfully. "These months carrying our son, bringing him into the world, loving him with every fiber of my being, have made me understand something." She touched Alexander's face gently. "My father hurt me terribly. But if I allow that hurt to turn me into someone so full of hate that I can't even consider forgiveness, then he's still controlling my life. And I refuse to give him that power." Alexander studied her for a long moment. "Are you sure about that? You don't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not to him." "It's not for him," she said. "It's for me to prove to myself that I survived, that I can look him in the eye without fear, that I've built a life so full of love that his cruelty can no longer touch me." She paused. "But only if you're by my side. I wouldn't face him alone." "Always," he promised. "If that is what you desire, then I will arrange it. But be warned, I will not be cordial, and at the first hint of him causing any discomfort, he will depart immediately." Evangeline smiled, pressing a kiss to his lips. "I would expect nothing less from my fierce protector." The visit was arranged for a week later, giving Evangeline time to prepare mentally. When the day arrived, she was surprisingly calm. She dressed carefully in a sky-blue gown that Alexander favored, deliberately choosing a cut that left her shoulders partially exposed. If her father came, he would see that she no longer hid her scars in shame. Viscount Ashford arrived exactly on time, his carriage grand, but showing signs of deferred maintenance. When he alighted, Evangeline noticed that he seemed to have aged considerably since she had last seen him on her wedding day. His hair had more silver, deeper lines etched around his mouth and eyes. "Thornfield Hall was even more imposing than he had imagined," the Viscount said in greeting as Alexander and Evangeline welcomed him into the formal drawing room. "You have prospered, Duke." "As have I," Alexander said coolly. "Allow me to be direct, Ashford. This visit is permitted at my wife's request, not out of any desire of mine to cultivate family ties with you. Do you understand?" The Viscount stiffened. "I understand perfectly, Duke, and I thank Lady Evangeline for her kindness." He turned to his daughter, his eyes sweeping over her before lingering briefly on her exposed shoulders. "I see marriage suits you well, daughter. You are bolder than I remember." "I am happier than I have ever been," Evangeline said evenly. "And I appreciate you noticing the shoulders. Yes, these are the marks you left. I no longer hide them. They are part of my history, though they do not define it." The Viscount's face flushed. "I came in peace, not to be confronted with the truth." Alexander interrupted. "You came to my wife's house and she chose to be honest. If that makes you uncomfortable, the door is open for your departure." "No," the Viscount said quickly. "No, he seemed to struggle with himself. Then finally said, I came because I received your message about the birth of a grandson and because he hesitated because there are things that should have been said long ago." Evangeline exchanged a look with Alexander, then gestured to a chair. "Then speak, father." He sat down, suddenly looking less like the imposing aristocrat and more like a tired old man. "After your mother died," he began. He stopped himself, began again. "Your mother was the only one who tempered my worst instincts. Without her, I became someone I no longer recognize. The gambling, the anger, the need to control everything because I felt so out of control." He looked at Evangeline directly for the first time. "There is no excuse for what I did to you. None. You were a child, my child, and I should have protected you. Instead, I made your life a torment. And for that," he took a deep breath, "I ask for your forgiveness. I don't expect to receive it. I don't deserve it, but I ask it anyway." The silence that followed was profound. Evangeline felt tears sting the back of her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "I appreciate the words, Father," she finally said, "but words don't undo years of pain." "I understand," he said miserably, "so allow me to offer more than words." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "This is the revised will." He held it out to Alexander, who took it and read it quickly, his eyebrows rising. The Viscount continued, "Everything I own, all the property, the entire fortune, will be your son's upon my death. Not his distant cousins as originally planned. Your son, my grandson, will inherit everything. It's little, but it's all I can offer to try to repair the irreconcilable." Evangeline was stunned. "Why?" "Because the Viscount said, his voice breaking slightly, I want something good to come from our line. I want your son to have what I failed to give you, and perhaps if there is a God, this will make up for a fraction of my sins." Alexander, who had been watching this exchange with hawk-like eyes, finally spoke. "Words are cheap, Ashford. Actions are what matter. If you sincerely wish to amend, then you will live the rest of your days proving that you have changed. Not through grand gestures, but through daily consistency, and perhaps with enough time and sufficient proof, my wife might consider allowing you to meet your grandson. Until then, this visit is concluded." The Viscount rose, nodding in acceptance. "I understand. And Duke, Duchess, thank you for receiving me. I neither expected nor deserved such kindness." He paused in the doorway. "Evangeline," he said softly, using her name instead of her title for the first time in years, "I am proud of the woman you have become, in spite of me, not because of me. Remember that." After he left, Evangeline remained still for a long moment. Alexander moved to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. "I don't know," she admitted, confused, relieved, still angry all at the same time. He turned her to face him. "You know, you don't have to forgive him. No matter what he does now, it doesn't erase the past." "I know," she said, "and I don't know if I can ever forgive completely. But maybe," she paused thoughtfully, "maybe I can learn to let go, to not allow what he did to continue poisoning my present." Alexander pulled her into a hug. "That," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "is all anyone can ask for. And I will be here every step of the way, whether to support you in forgiveness or in continuing to keep your distance. The choice is yours." The following years brought change and growth for everyone at Thornfield Hall. Young Alexander thrived, becoming a cheerful and curious child with his father's eyes and his mother's gentle temperament. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Catherine Amelia, named in memory of the grandmother he would never know, and 3 years after that by another son, Thomas Edward. Each birth was easier than the last, as if Evangeline's body had finally learned the process. And with each child, Alexander and Evangeline discovered new depths in their love for each other. Viscount Ashford, true to his word, gradually changed his ways. He stopped gambling, began managing his estates more carefully, and wrote monthly to inquire about his daughter and grandchildren, never demanding, always just asking. After 3 years of such consistent behavior, Evangeline finally allowed him to visit again, this time to get to know young Alexander properly. The meeting was cautious, but cordial. The Viscount sat with his grandson, then 5, and listened with apparent fascination to the child's stories of his lessons and adventures. When young Alexander innocently mentioned that his papa said children should always ask questions and think for themselves, the Viscount was silent for a long moment, then said softly, "Your father is a wise man." I heard him well. The visits became an annual occurrence, always brief, always supervised, but gradually less tense. Evangeline never allowed the Viscount to be alone with the children, a line Alexander fully supported, but she allowed him to grandfather from a safe distance. And gradually, very gradually, something resembling peace settled between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was a truce, an acceptance that the past could not be changed, but the present and future could still be shaped. As for Evangeline herself, she blossomed in ways she never imagined possible on that wedding night so many years ago. Her first novel, published under a pseudonym, became surprisingly popular, leading to more requests from the publisher. She wrote stories of women finding strength in adversity, of men learning that kindness was not weakness, of families formed not just by blood, but by choice and love. And though few knew that the venerable Duchess of Thornfield was the author, those who did, primarily Alexander and his aunt, Lady Margaret, kept her secret and encouraged her in her art. Alexander had become an increasingly vocal advocate for social reform, particularly around child protections. He worked with members of Parliament to propose legislation that would make child abuse a legal crime rather than simply a private family matter. It was slow and often frustrating work, but he persevered, driven by the memory of the scars on his wife's back and the determination that no other child should endure the same. One spring evening, 10 years after their wedding, Alexander and Evangeline stood in the portrait gallery at Thornfield Hall, admiring their latest edition. It was a family portrait commissioned the previous year and finally completed. The artist had captured them perfectly. Alexander standing behind a seated Evangeline, his hands resting on her shoulders, their 3 children arranged around them. Young Alexander standing proudly beside his father, Catherine sitting on her mother's lap, and little Thomas kneeling at Evangeline's feet. And deliberately, because Evangeline had insisted, the dress she wore for the session had a neckline that clearly revealed the edges of her scars. "You are right about this portrait," Alexander had asked when she first suggested the style of the dress. "Everyone who visits will see it. And when they look," Evangeline had replied, "they will see not just the scars, but the family we built despite them. They will see that I survived, that I thrived, that I transformed pain into love. That is what I want our grandchildren and great-grandchildren to see when they look at this portrait. Not shame, but triumph." Now standing before the completed portrait, Alexander pulled her against his side. "I have something to tell you," he murmured. "Oh," she looked at him curiously. "When we married," he began, "I thought I was making a practical contract, acquiring a wife who would fulfill certain duties, who would manage my household, who would give me heirs. I didn't expect," he paused, searching for words, "I didn't expect to find my soulmate. I didn't expect to discover that love wasn't just for poets and fools, but something real and deep and transformative." Evangeline felt her heart swell. "Alexander," she whispered. "That first night," he continued, "when I saw the marks on your back, my initial anger was at the injustice of it, at the cruelty. But now looking back through all these years, I understand that those scars were a gift in a strange way. Not because the pain that caused them was good, but because facing them together, helping you heal them, taught me what truly matters. He taught me that strength is not hardness, that kindness is not weakness, that the strongest bonds are forged not in perfection, but in overcoming imperfections together." She turned completely in his arms, looking at the man who a decade ago had been essentially a stranger. Now he was her husband, the father of her children, her best friend and her greatest love. "Remember when you told me," she asked softly, "that first morning at Thornfield, that you wanted to show me that touch doesn't have to hurt?" He nodded. "Well," she continued, "you achieved that and more. You taught me that I am stronger than I ever knew, that my past doesn't define my future, that love, real and true, seeks not to control, but to liberate." Alexander pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. "So we are both changed," he murmured, "and grateful for it." They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other under the gaze of their family portraits as Thornfield Hall quieted for the night around them. From upstairs, they could hear the faint sound of children being tucked into bed by their governesses, laughter and protests about just one more story. "We should go," Evangeline said reluctantly. "Bedtime rituals await." "One more moment," Alexander urged, and there was something in his voice that made her pause. He guided her back to the portrait, positioning her so she could see both the painting and her reflection in the protective glass. "Look," he said softly. "Do you see what I see?" Evangeline studied the image, both the painted and the reflected. She saw a woman of 31, still beautiful despite having carried 3 children, with dark hair tied back in an elegant style, and eyes that shone with genuine contentment. She saw the scars on her shoulders, no longer hidden, but displayed as part of who she was. She saw a husband whose hands on her shoulders spoke of protection and partnership. She saw 3 healthy, happy children who would never know the fear that had defined her own childhood. "I see a family," she said finally. "A family built on love and truth." "I see exactly that," Alexander agreed. "And more. I see a woman who took what should have destroyed her and turned it into strength. I see a mother who is raising the next generation to be kind yet courageous. I see a wife who made me a better man than I ever was on my own." He turned her to face him. "And I see, most importantly, a survivor who refused to let her past dictate her future." Tears glistened in Evangeline's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. "How lucky I was to find you," she whispered. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he said with a smile. "It was fate, providence, the ordaining of the universe that 2 strangers would come together in a cold contract and discover, against all odds, that they had found exactly what neither of them knew they were looking for." He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. "Now let's put our children to bed," he said, offering his arm. "And then when the house is quiet, I have plans for you that are not at all befitting a duchess." She laughed, the sound echoing through the gallery. "Well," she said, taking his arm, "maybe I'm not feeling particularly like a duchess tonight. Maybe I'm simply feeling like Evangeline, a woman who loves her husband and wants to show him exactly how much." "Perfect," Alexander murmured, his eyes darkening with promise. "Then we agree." They left the gallery hand in hand, passing under the gaze of generations of Beaumonts watching them from their portraits. But unlike previous generations with their austere expressions and cold marriages of convenience, Alexander and Evangeline had created something different. They had created a marriage based not on duty but on choice, not on obligation but on genuine deep love. The children's room was an orderly chaos when they arrived, with young Alexander insisting he was too old for bedtime stories, while simultaneously begging for just one more. Catherine demanding her father check under the bed for imaginary monsters, and little Thomas already half asleep, but struggling to stay awake until his parents arrived to kiss him goodnight. Alexander and Evangeline moved through the ritual with practiced ease, each child receiving individual attention, hugs, kisses, and words of encouragement for the night's dreams. When they finally left the children's room, with 3 children finally settled, and the night governor sitting nearby with her sewing, they exchanged a look of exhausted but contented parents. "Our home," Evangeline said softly, "is full of life and love. It's everything I've ever wanted. It's everything I ever allowed myself to dream of," Alexander replied. "But now that I have it, I can't imagine living any other way." They walked slowly back to the Duchess's chambers, which over the years had become the couple's shared quarters, with Alexander's adjoining room serving more as a dressing room and private office than a separate bedroom. Within the sanctuary of his room, with the low fire casting golden light and the curtains drawn against the night, Alexander helped Evangeline out of her dress with fingers that still, after all these years, sent shivers of anticipation across her skin. When she was in only her chemise, he traced the familiar lines of her scars with a reverence that had never diminished. "These lines," he murmured, "tell a story I love to hear, a story of survival and strength." "And these," she said, touching the scar on his ribs from his time in the war, "tell a story of sacrifice and courage. We are both marked," he agreed, "and both stronger for it." He lifted her into his arms, carrying her to the bed with the ease of muscles still strong, despite years spent more in Parliament meetings than on battlefields. He gently placed her on the covers, then joined her, his large, warm body pressing against hers. "I love you," he said, the words as familiar now as breathing, but no less precious for their repetition. "I love your strength, your kindness, your refusal to be defined by what was done to you. I love how you mother our children, how you manage our home, how you pursue your passion for writing, even when society says such ambition is unseemly. I love every scar, every imperfection, every part of you." Evangeline felt her heart overflow, as it always did when he spoke like this. "And I love you," she replied. "I love how you transformed from a cold and distant duke into a warm and devoted husband. I love how you play with our children without concern for aristocratic dignity. I love how you fight in Parliament for changes that will protect children you will never know. I love how you look at me as if I were the most precious thing in your world. You are, he said simply, you and our children. Everything else is secondary. Then he kissed her, and in that kiss was a decade of intimacy, of learning each other's tastes and preferences, of discovering new ways to give and receive pleasure. His hands moved over her body with familiar knowledge, finding the places that made her arch and sigh, and she responded in kind, her own hands, exploring the muscles and contours she had memorized, but never tired of rediscovering. When they finally joined, it was with the ease of years of practice, but also with an intensity of love that had never diminished. They moved together in the ancient rhythm, their breaths mingling, their bodies perfectly synchronized. And when they peaked together, it was with each other's names on their lips and love in their hearts. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the covers, Evangeline's breathing softening into sleep, Alexander lay awake longer, simply watching his wife rest. He thought of that first night when he had discovered her scars, and felt rage so intense it threatened his famed control. He thought of every night since, of all the times he had helped her heal not only her physical wounds, but her emotional ones. And he thought of how she in turn had healed him in ways he hadn't even realized he needed, teaching him that it was possible to be strong and kind, powerful and compassionate, a duke and a devoted family man. Society saw them as an exemplary couple, the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield, whose partnership was envied by many. But only they knew the full truth, the journey they had taken from strangers bound by contract to lovers united by choice. Only they knew the night spent facing past demons, the tears shed and comforted, the painful revelations and gradual healing. And only they understood that true marriage was not about perfection, but about facing imperfections together with honesty, patience, and unwavering love. Evangeline stirred in her sleep, instinctively moving closer to his warmth, and Alexander smiled in the darkness. Yes, he thought, pulling her closer. This was exactly what marriage should be. Not the cold duty he had imagined on their wedding night, but this warmth, this connection, this certainty that no matter what came, they would face it together. The years continued to pass at Thornfield Hall, each bringing its own joys and challenges. Young Alexander grew into a responsible young man who showed great promise both in his studies and in understanding the responsibilities he would one day inherit. Catherine developed a passion for painting, discovering her grandmother's old studio and spending hours there creating works that demonstrated remarkable talent for one so young. And Thomas, the youngest, revealed himself to be an adventurous spirit, constantly finding new ways to get into innocent mischief that kept the entire household both exasperated and delighted. Evangeline continued writing, her novels gaining increasing popularity under her pseudonym. She used her platform to weave subtle messages about social justice, women's rights, and the importance of treating children with dignity and respect. And while few knew that the venerable Duchess of Thornfield was the author, those who suspected chose to keep the secret. Recognizing the value of her words, Alexander, for his part, finally saw some of his legislative efforts bear fruit. A law was passed, though weaker than he had hoped, which for the first time recognized that parents had limits on how they could discipline their children. It was only a start, but it was a start, and he would continue to fight for more. Viscount Ashford became a regular if distant presence in the lives of his grandchildren. He never fully regained Evangeline's trust, nor did he expect to, but he consistently showed through his actions that he was a changed man. When he passed peacefully in his sleep in Evangeline and Alexander's 15th year of marriage, she found she could mourn him, not for the father he had been, but for the father he had tried to become in recent years. At the funeral, as she stood beside Alexander with her 3 children arranged around them, she realized she had finally found something approaching peace with her past. The scars remained, always would, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of his story, a story that also included love, family, triumph, and redemption. That night after the funeral, when all the guests had departed and the children were in bed, Evangeline and Alexander found themselves back in their chambers. She stood before the window, gazing at the stars that dotted the night sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. "At peace," she said, and realized it was true. He had caused so much harm, so much suffering, but in the end he had tried to make amends. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was something. And that, she turned in his arms, is more than many receive. Alexander studied her face in the dim candlelight. "You are the most extraordinary woman I know," he said. "The journey you have taken from that frightened young woman on your wedding night to the confident woman before me now is nothing short of miraculous. I didn't do this alone," she reminded him. "I had a guide, a partner, a love who showed me the way. We were each other's guides," he corrected. "You taught me as much as I taught you." They stayed like that for a long moment, embraced in the stillness of their sanctuary. Two people who had found each other through unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful from the ruins of painful pasts. And when they finally moved to the bed, when they joined once more in the ancient dance of husband and wife, it was not with the urgency of youth, but with the deep certainty of a love matured and tested by time. 20 years after that wedding night, Evangeline found herself again in a bridal chamber, but this time as an observer rather than a participant. Her daughter Catherine, now a young woman of 18, was marrying a young viscount who had courted her for 2 years before finally winning Alexander's approval to ask for her hand. Evangeline helped Catherine dress for the ceremony, her fingers deftly arranging the lace veil and adjusting the folds of the ivory silk gown. "Hugh will be fine," she assured her daughter, who was understandably nervous. "Lord Hampton is a good man. He truly loves you." "I know, Mama," Catherine said, "but I'm still nervous. What if I'm not a good wife? What if I disappoint him?" Evangeline cooped her daughter's face in her hands, forcing Catherine to meet her eyes. "You heard me correctly, dear. Marriage is a partnership, not a performance. You will be a good wife not by being perfect, but by being honest, by communicating openly, by choosing him every day, even when it's difficult. And if Lord Hampton is half the man I believe him to be, he will do the same for you." She paused, then added softly, "And if you ever need advice, support, a place to retreat, Thornfield Hall will always be your home. Your father and I will always be here." Catherine hugged her mother tightly. "Thank you, Mama, for everything, for showing me what true love looks like, for teaching me that strength and kindness are not opposites, for being exactly the mother I always needed." Evangeline felt tears sting, but refused to let them fall and ruin her makeup. "You are my greatest pride," she whispered. "You and your brothers." The ceremony was beautiful, held in the gardens of Thornfield Hall under a canopy of spring flowers. As Evangeline watched her daughter exchange vows with Lord Hampton, she felt Alexander take her hand, squeezing it gently. "One of 3 married," he murmured. "Only 2 more to go." Evangeline smiled through her tears. "Don't rush them," she whispered back. "Let them enjoy their youth before the responsibilities of marriage and family claim them." "How we didn't," he said, and there was a touch of regret in his voice. "No," she agreed, "but we found our way to something beautiful anyway." That evening, after all the guests had left, and the house had finally quieted, Evangeline found herself again in the portrait gallery, staring at the painting of her family done a decade earlier. The children in the painting were so young, little Thomas just a baby. Now Thomas was 10, Catherine was married, and young Alexander was at university, preparing for the responsibilities he would one day inherit. Time had passed so quickly, each year bleeding into the next until suddenly decades had passed. "Reminiscences," a familiar voice said, and she turned to find Alexander joining her. "Always," he added with a smile. "Just thinking about how life changes," she said. "How far we've come from that first night when I barely knew you and was so scared of what to reveal." "And now," he said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist, in a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing. "Now there are no secrets between us. No fear, only love and trust built through years of partnership." Evangeline leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solidity. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked. "About our marriage, about how it began?" Alexander considered the question seriously. "I regret the suffering you endured before we met," he finally said. "I regret not being able to protect you from that." "But the marriage itself, how did it begin?" "No, because every step we took, even the difficult ones, brought us to this place, to this life we built together, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." "Neither would I," she agreed. "Even with everything I've suffered, even with the scars I still carry, I wouldn't change a thing if it meant not finding you, not having our children, not having this life." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Alexander said, "There's something I never told you about that first night." "Oh." She turned in his arms to face him. "When I first saw your scars," he said slowly, "my first emotion was anger. Anger for what your father had done. But my second emotion right behind was fear." "Fear," she repeated, surprised. "Of what?" "Fear that I would ruin everything," he admitted. "Fear that I wouldn't know how to help you heal. Fear that my own emotional limitations, my reputation for coldness, would mean I would fail you exactly when you needed someone most." "But you didn't," she said fiercely. "You were exactly what I needed. Your strength when I was weak, your certainty when I doubted, your patience when I needed time. Alexander touched her face gently because you taught me how to be these things. Before you, I was effectively the cold duke that society thought I was. You showed me that there was more to me, more that I was capable of being." "Then we saved each other," she said softly, "in ways neither of us expected." "Precisely," he agreed, "and we will continue to save each other every day for the rest of our lives. That is what true marriage means." Alexander and Evangeline's twilight years were spent in quiet contentment. They saw all three of their children marry well and grandchildren born and raised. Alexander eventually retired from public life, passing the baton of parliamentary responsibility to young Alexander, who proved to be as dedicated to social reform as his father. Evangeline continued writing until arthritis made holding a pen too painful, and then dictated her stories to Catherine, who had revealed herself to have inherited both her mother's literary talent and her passion for social justice. On a winter evening, 42 years after that fateful wedding night, Alexander and Evangeline sat together in their chambers, the same room where so many memories had been made. The fire crackled merrily in the grate, warding off the chill outside. Their hair was silver now, their bodies showing the wear of years, but their eyes, when they looked at each other, still held the warmth and love they had cultivated over the decades. "Have you been happy?" Evangeline asked, asking the question she had asked countless times over the years, but never tired of hearing answered. "With our life together?" Alexander took her hand, his fingers now bent with age, intertwining with hers. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," he replied. "The answer is true now as it had always been. You have given me everything that matters: love, family, purpose, joy. What more could a man ask for?" She smiled, squeezing his hand. "I regret nothing," she said, "not even the suffering you brought, because it led me to you." Alexander lifted her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles as he had 1,000 times before. "When my time comes," he said softly, "my only regret will be leaving you." "Don't talk like that," she protested. "You still have years." "Maybe," he said, "or maybe not. Neither of us knows how much time we have left. But this I know. Every day I had with you was a gift. And when we part, whether I go first or you, I will know that I have lived a life filled with more love than most experience in 10 lifetimes." Evangeline felt tears slide down her wrinkled cheeks. "I love you," she whispered, "today and always." "I love you too," he replied, "today, tomorrow, and in any life that may come after this." They stayed like that, hands clasped, as the fire burned low and the night deepened around them. Two people who had begun as strangers bound by contract, who had faced past demons and built a future together, who had transformed cold duty into deep and lasting love. And when they finally moved to bed, when they lay side by side as they had countless nights before, it was not with the passion of youth, but with something deeper, with the certainty of a love tested by time and proven true, of a partnership that had weathered all storms, of two hearts that had beaten as one for so long they could not imagine existing apart. The scars Evangeline bore still marred her skin, faded with age, but never completely gone. But they no longer represented shame or pain. They represented survival, triumph, the journey she had taken from victim to victor. And every time Alexander traced those familiar lines, it was with reverence and love, reminding them both of where they began and how far they had come together. This was their story, the story of two people scarred by difficult pasts who found healing and hope in each other's arms. A story that had begun with a cold wedding night and reluctant duty, but had blossomed into something beautiful, profound and lasting. A love story that had transcended societal expectations and marriage contracts, becoming instead a union of souls. And as the fire finally died to embers and sleep claimed them, Alexander and Evangeline Beaumont, Duke and Duchess of Thornfield, rested peacefully, wrapped in each other's arms, and in the love they had built together, scar by scar, day by day, year by year, until it had become the very foundation upon which they had built their lives. Their wedding night had been cold and marked by shocking revelations, but it had led to 42 years of the warmest and most loving marriage anyone could hope for. And in it they found not only happiness but complete and lasting redemption. End. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support inspires us to keep creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. Help us reach our first 2,000 subscribers, and together we'll continue sharing tales that warm the heart. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and let yourself be enchanted by another unforgettable tale. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.